Okay, welcome back to Math Partake. Today we're learning how to subtract fractions with the same denominator. Now you're going to be subtracting two fractions, and in the end, you will get one fraction as your answer. Now let's quickly look at the top right-hand side and just glance over at the three things that you need to know to solve these type of problems. The first thing is you're going to need to know the difference between a numerator and a denominator. The numerator, as you may already know, is the top half of the fraction. And then the denominator is the bottom half of the fraction. Okay? You're also going to need to know basic subtraction. Lastly, you're also going to need to know how to find the greatest common factor. And that we'll go over it later once we have to use it in a problem. All right, so let's get started. Let's look at example number 1. Example 1 says 13 over 16 minus 2 over 16. One of the first things that you should be noticing is that these two fractions have the same denominator. So that actually leads us to step 1. Step 1 is to ask yourself, do both fractions have the same denominator? And that answer is yes, they do have the same denominator. So because of that, we're going to solve this a specific way. So we're going to combine the numerators. All right. And that's going to be the top of our fraction. And as far as the denominator is concerned, we're going to keep the same denominator. Keep the same denominator. Okay? So this is what our new fraction is going to look like. So let's look on to step number 2. Step number 2 is, well, exactly what we wrote down. We're going to keep the same denominator. So I'm going to put a little equal sign there. I'll make my fraction line. And we're going to keep our same denominator. So if we look at the example, our denominators are both the same and they are 16. So right underneath this fraction line, we're going to write 16. So far, so good. Now let's look at step 3. In step 3, we combine the numerators. So if we look at our example, we see we have numerators of 13 and 2. And then they're separated by a subtraction sign. So we're simply just going to write that as our numerator. We're going to combine it. 13 minus 2 is our new numerator. All right. Moving on to the next step. Now we're just going to finish it off. We're going to finalize everything. Okay. So step 4, we're going to solve this numerator. I'll make an equal sign. Our numerator says 13 minus 2. And if we do 13 minus 2, we're going to come up with 11. So we have 11 here. We'll keep that 16 right there. At this point, we have a brand new fraction. The 5th step would be to simplify the fraction using the greatest common factor, if it's possible. I just want you to understand. The way to think about the greatest common factor is there any number that can divide evenly into the numerator, which is 11, or the denominator, which is 16? The answer is no, because there's no number that's going to divide evenly into both 11 and 16 besides the number 1. So therefore, this fraction can't be simplified and we're done. So 11 over 16 is your answer. All right, so let's take a look at example 2. So example 2 says 2 over 8 minus 7 over 8. So step 1, do both fractions have the same denominator? The answer is yes. So we're going to combine the numerators. Okay. And we're going to keep the same denominator. All right. Step 2, we'll make our equal sign. make our fraction line, and we see that our denominator is 8. So let's write that down. Step 3, we're going to combine the numerators. If we look at our example, we see that the numerators are 2 and 7, and they're split by a subtracting sign again. Okay, so let's write that down. 2 minus 7. Very simple so far. Now, we're going to solve this numerator and get closer to finishing our example. So we'll put our equal sign, and we'll say that 2 minus 7 is going to be negative 5. And we're keeping our denominator, which is 8. Now, what I like to do with this is understand that if one number in the fraction is a negative, that means the entire fraction is a negative. So what I usually do is I would move this negative right beside the fraction instead of having it as part of the numerator. So now we have a negative 5 over 8. Now, let's move to our fifth and final step that says simplify the fraction using the greatest common factor if possible. Okay, so let's look at negative 5 over 8. Is there any number besides the number 1 that will go evenly into the numerator, which is 5, or the denominator, which is 8? The answer is no. Therefore, we can't simplify this any further, and our answer is negative 5 over 8. Okay, moving on to example number 3. Now this one, it looks a little different, but you see that the process is pretty much the same. So now we're in a situation where we're going from having just maybe some would say regular fractions to now having two mixed fractions. All right. So when you're talking about mixed fractions, what you really have is a fraction combined or connected to a whole number. So if you look at example number 3, where you have two mixed fractions, what you really have is 2 over 5, which is very similar to the fractions that we've been dealing with. And then you have a whole number right next to it, which is 4. Collectively, this entire fraction is considered a mixed fraction. And it's the same thing with the other term. You have 1 and 1 over 5. So the 1 over 5 is a fraction. The 1 is a whole number, but together, all of that will give you a mixed fraction. So let's get to work. We're going to deal with the fractions first, and then we'll deal with the whole numbers. Okay? So let's cover these whole numbers and act like they don't exist for a moment and do the fractions. Okay. So when you're looking at this, the first thing you should notice is that these two fractions have the same denominator. So if they have the same denominator, you already know what we need to do. So next step, let's keep our same denominator. We're going to make our fraction line. We'll put a 5 underneath because that is our denominator that's shared in both fractions. And then we'll move on to step number 3, is to combine the numerators. So we're going to write 2 minus 1, just like we see it in our example. Step 4, we're going to solve this numerator. 2 minus 1 is going to be equal to 1. And then we keep in our denominator, which is 5. So we have our new fraction. From this point, we can look at step 5. Step 5 is to simplify using the greatest common factor. But again, we don't have a situation where we need to simplify because there's no number that goes into 1 and 5 evenly besides the number 1 itself. So 1 over 5 is good. Now we have our new fraction, but there's one part that we don't want to forget about to finish this off. We have to now uncover our two whole numbers and then combine those. Okay? So step number 6 is to combine and solve your whole numbers. So let's do that. Down here, we're going to write 4 minus 1. And that 4 minus 1 is equal to 3. Now, the 7th and final step is to place the new whole number, which is 3, right besides our fraction, which is 1 over 5. Here. So we have 3 and 1 over 5. And that is your answer. Okay, so our final example for today is going to be 1 and 3 over 20 minus 9 and 11 over 20. Or you could say 1 and 3/20 minus 9 and 11/20. They mean the same thing. Now let's cover up the whole numbers because we're going to work with the fractions first and then combine the whole numbers later. All right. So the first thing we should be looking at and we should notice is that, yes, both fractions have the same denominator. So that means that we're going to combine numerators. Okay. So now moving on to the next part. We're keeping our denominator, and we see, if we look at the fractions, our denominator is 20. So we'll make our fraction line. We're going to have our 20 here. And let's go on to the next step where we see that we have to combine our numerators. So we're going to write exactly what we see, which is 3 minus 11. For the fourth step, we're going to solve this numerator. So equals 3 minus 11 is going to be negative 8. We have a negative 8, and then we keep our denominator still. We have a 20. So now we have negative 8 over 20. So what do we do from here? Well, this is the first example that we're going to use the greatest common factor because there is a number that divides into both 8 and 20 evenly. I'm going to show you one quick way to find out the greatest common factor of 8, which is our numerator, and 20. So let's say on the side, we made a quick table that has the number 8 that represents our numerator and the number 20 that represents our denominator. On the side that says 8, you're going to list all the numbers that can be divided evenly into 8 with the exception of the number 1. I would say that 2 can be divided into 8 evenly. 4 can be divided into 8 evenly. And 8, of course, it's itself. It can be divided into 8 evenly. That's it. Now let's look at the side that says 20. And we're going to write down all the numbers that can be divided into 20 evenly. All of these factors of 20. So we have a 2. And we also have a 4. Because 20 divided by 4 is 5. So we also have a 5. And then we have a 10. And we also have a 20. Now that we have our list of the factors of 8 and also the factors of 20, we have to find what is the greatest common factor between the two of them. So the question is, what's the highest number on both sides of the table? What's the highest factor? You should see. It's a 4. We have a 4 here. We have a 4 here. In order to simplify our fraction, we have to divide both the numerator and the denominator by the greatest common factor. So let's do that. I want to extend this fraction line, and I'm going to divide negative 8 by 4, and then I'm going to divide 20 by 4. And when I solve this, I'll have the simplified fraction. So we'll put our equal sign, we'll look at the numerator, we'll say, well, what is negative 8 divided by 4? Negative 8 divided by 4 is negative 2. Now let's look at the denominator. 20 divided by 4 is 5. Excellent. So now we have our new fraction. It's simplified and it's ready to be combined with our whole numbers. So let's uncover our whole numbers and let's solve that. So our whole numbers say 1 minus 9. 1 minus 9 is equal to negative 8. So now we have our new fraction, which is negative 2 over 5, And we have our new whole number, which is negative 8. Now our last step is going to be to place the new whole number right beside the new fraction, and then we're done. So we have negative 8. And this negative 2 over 5, we're going to remove that negative because we're not subtracting, we're combining them at the end. 2 over 5. So now you have your answer. Negative 8 and 2/5, or negative 8 and 2 over 5. Hey, thanks for watching. For more answers and help that you may need in math, subscribe to Math Partake.